All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started here. Sorry about the delay. Just having some issues that we're trying to get cleared up. My name's Tyler Butler. I'm a program manager with Microsoft. I specifically work on the SharePoint team. My area of focus is primarily on web content management and internet websites built on SharePoint. And in fact, that's what I'm going to be talking to you today about. However, before we get started, just want to apologize because I have been planning a trip to Hawaii for quite some time. I live out in the Seattle area. It's pretty cold, it's pretty rainy, and I have just been dying to get to Hawaii. And unfortunately, I have not yet booked my tickets. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and book my flight. And in order to do that, I'm going to go to hawaiianair.com. Just see here. Wow, these hotel internet connections. Okay, here we go. Wow. Now this looks a little bit different than the last time I was here. Last time it was kind of different. Now this is interesting. Wow, it's pretty interactive. It's got some nice stuff going on here. I just click on through and go and book my travel. Now I have to wonder, looking at this site, what software they're actually using to build this. Now, I would leave it up as an exercise for the reader to figure that out, but I'll give you a little sneak preview. This website is actually running off of SharePoint Server 2007. It went live a few weeks ago. If you go to hawaiianair.com right now, you'll see it. It's running SharePoint. I'll bet you, if you have experience with SharePoint, that this looks very, very different from any other SharePoint site that you would ever have seen. And during the course of our talk today, we'll be discussing exactly how you can go about using SharePoint as a platform to really enable sites that look like this, and how SharePoint enables all of those great scenarios. So let's go ahead and get started here. So the crux of today's talk is really just one sentence: that SharePoint is a great platform for building internet scale websites that are open and available to millions of users. And so during the course of our talk today, I'd like you to think back on this statement and see how everything we're going to be talking about is really angled directly at this particular statement, that SharePoint is a fantastic platform for internet scale websites. In terms of agenda, we're going to start with a brief discussion of internet website characteristics. What exactly is it that characterizes an internet website? We'll talk a little bit about SharePoint specifically. We'll talk about how to customize SharePoint and what features it provides to customize the look and feel. We'll talk about how SharePoint makes the designer's life easier. Are there any designers in the audience today? Okay, we got a few. Your lives are a lot easier, and we'll show you how. And then we'll talk about how SharePoint can let you open your site up to millions of users. And then if we have a little bit of time for the developers in the audience, we'll talk about how SharePoint as a platform can be used to enable some of the great new technologies you're learning about at this conference. And with that, let's go ahead and dig right in. So I want to frame our discussion about internet website characteristics with a little bit of a disclaimer. The list that I've come up with is by no means exhaustive, and it's not intended to be. Rather, what I've tried to do is structure this so that our discussion can focus around characteristics that are common to many of the internet websites that you all would probably be familiar with. First of all, internet websites typically have a unique look and feel. Increasingly, this may seem rather obvious to us now, but increasingly businesses are looking at internet websites as another avenue to connect with their customers and to reflect their corporate image. And so it's important for an internet website that belongs to a company to sort of reflect that look and feel, to reflect that corporate personality that they have. For example, hawaiianair.com doesn't want their website to look exactly like another website. Rather, they want to differentiate it. They want to provide things they want to have a look and a feel that is custom to their application. In addition, when you start talking about building an internet scale application, oftentimes if you're building a website that has content that's being published out, that's being written by authors internally and then getting published out, it probably has a slightly more controlled authoring environment than your personal blog, for example. On your personal website, you have full control. The buck stops with you. However, in a more controlled environment, you actually want there to be some workflows and perhaps some approval process that goes into place before things are actually live, before the world sees the content that's actually posted. And finally, when we start talking about internet scale, we're talking about letting the world come to your site. Now, it would be nice if every time you enabled anonymous users from the internet to visit your site that all of them did, because that would be great, right? Then we wouldn't have this worry with, well, are we getting enough traffic and are people coming to our site? That's not always the case, right? But when you open it up to the world can come and visit. And users expect increasingly high availability and good performance from the sites that they go and visit. As more and more people get broadband access, they expect snappy performance, they expect things to come back quickly, and that is important when you're thinking about internet websites. So let's take a step back real quick and think about SharePoint specifically. So I know from my sort of informal poll at the beginning of the talk that most of you are familiar with SharePoint. And I think if I was to hand you a piece of paper that had this sentence on it and asked you to fill in the blank, you may fill in the blank with some of the following things. You may say, people believe SharePoint is just for documents. That's all it's about. That's not true. SharePoint is a fantastic platform for a lot of different things, including documents, but it's also for web pages and other collateral, things like images, CSS files that go along with web pages, things like that. So SharePoint is a great place for a lot of different types of content, not just documents. People believe SharePoint is hard to customize or brand. SharePoint is fantastic if you like blue and yellow, because that's all you're ever going to get. And that may have been true in the past, but I'm here to tell you that creating a custom look and feel for your website is easier than ever, especially in the 2007 release. We've done a lot of work in this area. People believe SharePoint is only for the intranet. It's an application that you just can't think of, you can't even imagine deploying to the internet or even an extranet. It's intranet only. In reality, SharePoint is used in a variety of different deployments, including extranets and internet-facing websites like Hawaiian Air and some others that I'll show in just a moment. SharePoint is not just only for the intranet. And finally, people believe that SharePoint is not fast enough for internet sites. In fact, many internet sites are using SharePoint today. There are more examples other than Hawaiian Air that I'll show you, and there are plenty of examples of sites that are actually using SharePoint today. So let's real quick dive in a little bit and talk about this SharePoint is just for documents impression that people might have. With the 2007 release, we did a lot of work around something we call web content management. Well, we don't really call it that, sort of the industry calls it that. But there are sort of three things that we focused on, three general areas in WCM. We call them the ABCs of WCM. The A stands for authoring. So that's the experience that your authors get when they're creating content that goes on your site. The branding piece is about customizing the way that that content is then presented and getting it looking exactly like you'd want. And then we have a controlled publishing piece, which includes features like scheduling, the ability to specify that content doesn't go live until a specific time, the ability to put the content through an approval process where people need to sign off on it before it goes live, etc. But to be clear, all of the things that you are accustomed to in SharePoint apply, just like they do in documents, to the web pages, to things that we talk about in web content management. Specifically stuff like versioning, checking in, checking out, lists and libraries. Those are the building blocks of what we do. There's a powerful developer platform, just like there is in Windows SharePoint Services, there is also for the web content management stuff. And all of the things that we have in the 2007 release are really focused on getting you up and running sooner, getting your site up and running sooner so that you can focus on your site's content and on getting it looking the way that you want and not have to worry about all of the nuts and bolts that go into it. And while we don't have enough time to cover all of the stuff that we do, I do want to just do a real quick high-level overview of some of the things that we provide that allow you to focus on building your content. Specifically, one of the biggest problems people have when they're building content-centric websites is that you may have a lot of articles, say, in your site, and they may be categorized, but what you really want to do is provide some sort of navigation into that. You want to provide a way to do a roll-up page, a home page per se, that sort of rolls up all of the interesting content, say the latest 5 articles or the hottest 5 articles, etc. So we provide a lot of stuff out of the box that helps you just collect all of that content from across your environment and kind of promote it on your home page. Navigation is a common problem. How do we build out our navigation? How do we customize it? All of that stuff is provided as an out-of-the-box feature. Search is included. RSS feeds are bubbled up in a variety of different places. Access control is included because, as you know, in SharePoint, there's permissions and management. All of that stuff is included. There's workflow. You can create custom workflows. There are content approval workflows out of the box. There's a whole bunch of multilingual features so that you can build multilingual websites. There's publishing schedules, and the list goes on and on. So today, we're going to focus on a few key points and not all of that list. But after the talk, if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to talk to you more about anything at all related to this. So when you start digging into building your internet site, the first thing you may come to me and ask is, well, Tyler, I really like the SharePoint stuff. I like the things that it provides, but frankly, I want my site to look good. Can you do that? Yes, I can. But in order to explain how we're going to accomplish this, we first need to think a little bit about how web pages are developed and how they're built in SharePoint. So web pages are just like a special type of document in SharePoint. They're stored in a document library. The web pages use a master page, an ASP.2.0 master page, to determine the basic appearance. They use a template called a page layout, and that page layout specifies how the actual content of the page is put together. I'll show that in a demo in just a moment. And then the page content itself is actually stored in SharePoint list columns. And so if you come from a SharePoint background, a lot of this stuff should sound familiar. We're talking about libraries. We're talking about lists and columns in a list. We've got some ASP.NET constructs thrown in there. So we're not totally reinventing the wheel here. Rather, we're building on top of the SharePoint stack and adding things to it. So let's talk about what happens when a typical page gets requested. So imagine for a moment that you own the wonderful domain name foo.com, and you have a page in that website, welcome.aspx, that the user has requested. So the first thing that happens is the browser makes the request to the server. Next thing that happens is the page layout that is associated with that page is retrieved. Third, the master page that is associated with that page is also retrieved. And lastly, all of the actual contents of the page is loaded from that page's list item and gets stuffed into all of the controls that are on the page layout. And then all of that gets mashed together into one HTML stream that gets then delivered back to the browser and is rendered by the browser for the user. So what actually belongs in a master page then? I said earlier that a master page sort of controls the overall look and feel of a site, but what exactly is in a master page? Well, really, anything can be in a master page, but things that we typically would think of as being put in a master page are things like navigation, maybe your logo, a search box that's a typical place up in the top right-hand corner or left, depending, a login control if you're building a membership site. There may be some editing controls so that you can provide an in-page editing experience. This is how SharePoint works out of the box. There may be some CSS references. You're grabbing some style sheets. But really, any server control and markup. The rule of thumb when you're thinking about master pages is it something that is typically going to be shared among all pages in my site? If so, it probably belongs in a master page. If it's on a one-off basis, there may be more appropriate places to look at putting that markup. So I may use the term Chrome, web page Chrome. And so typically we think of the master page representing the web page Chrome, the stuff that appears along the top, along the left or the right-hand side, and along the footer perhaps. That's what we call the Chrome. That's typically what goes in the master page. So let me just show a quick demo here of what it looks like to actually switch a master page. And this is seem to be having some problems here. Well, unfortunately, it looks like our demos are not going to be visible. I apologize for that, but I'd like to go ahead and continue. I do have these demos on my laptop, and so for anyone who's willing or interested to swing by, I'll kind of talk through what the demo would show, and then I'm happy to walk through it on my laptop after the talk if you guys are interested. So apologies for that, but let's go ahead and move on. So specifically, you may be asking yourself, and what I was going to show in the demo was, what's the real value of being able to use a master page in SharePoint? Because ASP.NET has master pages. I know, that's nothing new to me. I know how I can use master pages to change the look and feel of a site. Well, the real power that SharePoint provides is a sort of management story around that, because your master pages they are just other type of SharePoint content. They live in the SharePoint database. They can go through an approval process. They can go through all of the same steps that other SharePoint content goes through. There's also a way to switch master pages on a site without changing any of the markup that is actually in the pages. And if you've used ASP.NET, you know that the page actually references a master page. And so if you want to go and touch all of the pages in a given site, you need to touch in multiple places potentially, depending on how you've architected your system. So SharePoint abstracts that all away into one setting on the site that you can go and change, and you can specify that you want to use any particular master page that you see fit. So just to kind of give you an example of different types of sites with different master pages that have completely different look and feels, we have hawaiianair.com, which we just looked at. We also have a couple of others here. This is a fairly new one, glue.com. Then we also have HeadCandy, spelled kind of strangely, H-E-D-K-A-N-D-I. These are all live on the net right now. Glue is a brand new site. I don't know much about it, but it seems to be casual gaming. This is all built on Office SharePoint Server. Again, I think you'd be hard-pressed to convince someone that this was based on SharePoint, especially if they had any experience with, say, SharePoint version 2 or even SPS 2003. We also have, there's another example, and honestly, I can kind of go on with examples till the cows come home. There's a great website. I have a link to it in my presentation that has a list of public sites that you can actually go look at that are built on SharePoint. So if you're interested, if you have a particular type of site that you're thinking about building, you want to see, are there other people that have built something similar, and what have they done? There's a great resource that you can go and look at. I can't remember if this is the exact URL or not, but there is the Body Shop has a campaign called Wise Woman, and their website for that campaign is also built using MOS 2007. So, but again, I have a list of all of those available, and I'm happy to talk to you more about anything that you see here. So we've talked about master pages. We've talked about how they sort of provide the overall look and feel for a website, the things that are typically shared among all the pages in the site. But we haven't really gotten into what exactly a page layout is. So if you think about what the Chrome of the page is, anything that isn't in the Chrome of the page is typically controlled by the page layout. So they're combined to provide the fully rendered version of the page. So the page layout essentially provides a template for all of the content that is actually in the page. The page layout references the master page to get its Chrome, but the really powerful thing that we have here is the ability to switch page layouts just like you can switch master pages. So similar to the way you can switch a master page to get a different look and feel for your site, you can switch a page layout without changing any of the content of your site, any of the content of the page, and actually get it laid out separately. So you may be asking yourself, well, what's the real value here? What does the page layout allow me to do? Well, the page layout allows a designer or a site owner to exert a little bit of control over the design of the site. It allows them to define what can be authored in the page, exactly where it's positioned, how it looks. And they can define at the page layout level how much control the actual author that's creating the content has over the appearance of that content. For example, you may wish to provide an HTML region of the page where your author is going to go in and type in some text. However, you want to be sure that your author can only select from some pre-approved styles, some pre-approved CSS styles that you've defined. And you want to ensure that they can only select from those so that it looks appropriate when they go and write their content. That's the level of control that you can exert at the page layout level. You can control how all of that is presented. You can also control it. There's a variety of different ways. The HTML example is interesting because you can specifically say, I don't want the users, when they are editing content in this field, to be able to bold text or to be able to format it in any way. So that's one interesting example, but there's another example where you may want to specify that the image that appears in the top left-hand corner always has a particular CSS class applied to it. And you can do that by wrapping that control in an appropriate CSS class such that when it renders, it has that appropriate style. So the value of this is that as a designer or as a site owner who is concerned about the appearance of your site, you can still open it up to business users or to authors that may not have as much savvy as you do about the way that the site should look. And you can do that with some confidence because you can exert some control into their experience as to what they can do. So that sounds great if you're running a Big Brother-esque website where you don't trust your authors or for some reason you want them to be restricted in some way. But does SharePoint impose that on you? Do you have to use that level of restriction? And the answer is no. I look at SharePoint in terms of constraints as a very sort of a long continuum. On the left-hand side, we have a more ad hoc environment. So you can imagine, you guys are familiar with SharePoint, so you know what a team site is, or an individual's My Site, for example. An individual's My Site, they have complete control. They should be able to do anything they want, perhaps. They can drag in web parts, they can rearrange the content. But as you move up towards a more constrained environment, perhaps a team site or a divisional site, or moving on up to the extranet or the intranet, you may want to exert more control over that. And so SharePoint sort of grows up with you, and you don't have to choose one or the other, but rather you can use a combination of the two. For example, you may want to specify that for a given article, it has an image in the top right-hand corner, has some article text, and then the author's name. But then at the bottom, you may want to allow a specific set of web parts to be added there that loads some specific content. And your author gets to choose which web part is appropriate for the type of article they're writing. So you can specify to that level of granularity using the page layouts and using things like web parts and field controls how exactly the author can interact with the page. So at this point, I would like to have shown exactly what the authoring experience is like in Office 2007, so what the authors actually see. How many of you have actually used, have edited a page in MOS 2007? Okay, so a few of you. So one of the things that's interesting, that's somewhat unique, the page editing experience in MOS 2007 is very in context. When you create a new page, when you edit an existing page, you actually go to it, you click a button, it brings an alternate view of the page that's in edit mode, you edit the content directly, and then you can route it through an approval process, or if you have the appropriate permissions, you can publish it immediately, etc. And all of that plays together with the page layouts and the master page to actually provide the final look and feel. And as I mentioned previously, switching a page layout is very interesting because while today your article pages may have all of their images on the left, tomorrow your designer may come and do a redesign of your site and may decide that now all images need to actually be on the right, and they need to be a little bit lower, and they need to have a different CSS class applied to them. Well, do I have to go and touch every article that was ever published on my site to do that? The answer is no. Because page layouts are shared among all pages, now I can just go create a new page layout or edit an existing one, and then all of my pages all of a sudden will switch and start using that new page layout. So there's some real power there for sort of long-term management, because templatization systems can work fine when you're only dealing with 5 pages, but when you have 500 or 5,000, then the management problem comes to the forefront. So you may be thinking to yourself now, well, Tyler, all of this sounds fantastic. You know, it sounds like you guys have done a lot of work in this area. It sounds like there's some great new features, but frankly, all of this is null and void. It's moot to me because I want to go fast. And I just don't think that I, like Ricky Bobby, really need to go fast. So in order to achieve that with MOS 2007, we have one little feature. Well, it's actually one really big feature that kind of pokes its head up in a lot of different places, but it's called caching. Now, the concept of caching isn't really all that complicated. It's something that a lot of different websites use. It's something that's, it's a computer science concept that's been around since, the dawn of ages. I kind of like this definition because it makes me sound smarter than I actually am. The goal of caching is to minimize work per request in order to increase performance for internet scale. Really, that's just a wordy way of saying caching tries to make your website fast. There are 3 types of caching in MOS, 3 core kinds of caching. We're going to talk about 2 of them that are most interesting to the internet scenarios. First of all, we have the page output cache. So if you're familiar with ASP.NET, this may not be new to you. You may have already heard of this. But as you're aware, when someone requests a web page from an ASP.NET website, there's a server on the back end that's doing some work. It's figuring out what HTML should be rendered, what HTML should be sent back to the user's browser. Well, one way to do this is every single time the page is requested, the server goes and does some work and then spits back the same HTML. And then the next time the page is requested, it does the exact same work and spits back HTML. The problem is that in reality, typically, it's doing the same work over and over and over and over again. Because if you think about your home page, or a better example may be an article page that has some static content, that article doesn't really change all that much. And so that content, once the web server has done its work and has actually rendered out that HTML doesn't change. So why does it have to go and figure out again what HTML it needs to render back to the user? So the solution to that is to basically cache the version of the page that was rendered, so that HTML gets written down in the cache, and then future subsequent requests just hit the cache directly, and the server doesn't actually have to do any work. It can just spit back the HTML. Excuse me. So to kind of see this in graphical form, you can imagine that initially a request comes in, and SharePoint does a whole bunch of work. It goes to the database, it grabs some content, it does a whole bunch of calculations, what rights does the user have, yada, yada, yada. Goes back and grabs a whole bunch of data, pushes it all into one HTML stream, and then sends it back to the requesting user. It also puts a copy in the cache, and then the next request that comes in goes directly to the cache and is serviced directly from there. And so there's no round trip in terms of server load that's used there. Another type of caching is disk-based caching. And this is interesting because there are a lot of other stuff that the browser downloads other than just the HTML that it uses to render the page. Most notably, images, CSS, and JavaScript. All of that stuff can be included as separate files. And so what happens is the browser gets the HTML, it then figures out, oh, I need to go and grab this JavaScript, I need to get this CSS, I need to grab these images, and so it issues subsequent requests to grab all of those resources and download those and then display them. So what disk-based caching allows you to do is to cache those resources that are stored in the SharePoint database locally on disk on the web front end, such that subsequent requests don't have to go and grab that from the database. Because database access is just by nature slower than disk-based access, by caching this on the web front end, we remove the need to store these resources outside of SharePoint for performance. Because in the past, sometimes what people would do is they would say, well, I can't store this in the database because I need the performance that can only be provided by storing this stuff on the web front end, on the local disk. The problem there was that if it's not inside SharePoint, you don't get any of the great stuff that SharePoint provides, like the management aspect of it, the approval process, the check-in, check-out, the versioning, all of that stuff. You don't get it. So you have to kind of start managing it on your own, and it can get confusing and hard to manage very quickly. And so this feature allows you to still put those types of assets in SharePoint, but get the performance gains that come from storing those things and caching them on disk. Similar to the last example, the request comes in for specific files. In this example, there's some JavaScript, some images, and some CSS. Those files are then pushed back onto the web front end's local file system. And then the subsequent request for those files is all serviced directly from the cache. So one question that may come up with the caching stuff is, again, similar to the master page thing, ASP.NET also has, it doesn't have disk-based caching, but it has output caching. So how does SharePoint play with that? Well, really, we're just using ASP.NET output caching. But the really cool thing that we add on top is a management piece that allows you to specify at different levels of your SharePoint site, or for different buckets of users, different cache profiles. So these cache profiles are enabled by ASP.NET, and so you can define sort of how content is cached depending on what is appropriate for different scenarios. For example, for an internet-facing website, the one we talk most about is the anonymous user profile, right? Because typically on an internet-facing website, if you're getting a lot of hits, they're all coming in as an anonymous user. They never authenticate with your site. And in that case, since all of them are exactly the same, you can do some great caching work there. And so there's one particular profile that we ship out of the box that's focused on that scenario. But there's also interesting scenarios around authenticated users. You can still use output caching for authenticated users as well. There's just different things that you need to be aware of. And in order to manage this in an intelligent way, we provide a way to specify on a per site basis or even on a per page layout basis what cache profile ASP.NET should apply for that content. So I think this slide is probably something that you guys have heard before, that SharePoint is a platform. There are a lot of things that, as I said earlier, the goal of MOS 2007 is to really get your website up and running as quickly as possible, and we have a lot of features that are available to let you do that. But there's also a rich infrastructure and a rich platform that's available for developers to really dig in and enhance it in a lot of different ways. Part of the power of that comes from just being built on ASP.NET 2.0. So there's a lot of flexibility and inherent power that comes with that. One of the more interesting things that has arisen lately is ASP.NET AJAX framework integration. And I do have to provide one major caveat here. This is not, ASP.NET AJAX framework integration is not officially supported. At the earliest it will be supported is SP1. I can't make any guarantees or anything, but there's a SharePoint program manager named Mike Amerland who has a great blog post that I can point you to on how to get the AJAX framework working in SharePoint. There's a couple of things that you have to do. It's pretty straightforward, and he's got a great guide. People are doing this. I just need to be sure that you understand this is not officially supported until SP1 at the earliest. But AJAX sounds great, but the new hotness, at least the new hotness of the day, is Silverlight. And I have personal experience integrating Silverlight with SharePoint. In fact, I have a demo, which unfortunately you won't be able to see, but can come up and I can show it to you after. The demo is, so if you're familiar with the MOS 2007 authoring environment, as I mentioned earlier, it's in context. And so if you imagine what it would be like to actually select an image, you see an image placeholder there, and you click a button and you say browse, and you grab an image from SharePoint, and then it inserts the image into the page in the appropriate spot. And so what I have as a demo is actually doing the exact same thing, except in this case, you select a movie that is also stored in SharePoint, and then that movie is loaded in a Silverlight control with some rich interactivity there. And so that's just an example of some really cool, really straightforward ways that you can integrate new technologies into SharePoint as a platform. I've also seen people do virtual Earth mashups like nobody's business. It seems to be the thing to do. Virtual Earth data is everywhere. And really the sky's the limit. So there's just, I have yet to meet someone who has come to me and said, can I do this? And I've had to say no. Now, let's be clear. Sometimes it's more difficult than other times. But the sky really is the limit. There's a lot of flexibility and a lot of stuff that you're able to do. Again, we'll just skip over this demo. So I hope I've made it abundantly clear that SharePoint is a great platform for internet scale websites. I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions, and I'd really like to kind of open it up momentarily for those. In terms of learning more, there's a couple of great places that you can go. The sort of marketing information is on Microsoft.com/SharePoint, and there's a link there to Office SharePoint Server specifically. Real quick clarification in terms of terminology. I kind of use the SharePoint term kind of loosely, and just to clarify here. When I say SharePoint, rule of thumb, I'm typically always talking about MOS 2007. When I talk when I use the word SharePoint, that's typically what I'm talking about. If that's not clear, or if you're a little confused by something I said, please come talk to me. I'll clarify it for you. The team that I specifically work on, the Enterprise Content Management team, we have a blog where we post a lot of great information. It's blogs.msdn.com/ECM. We have, pretty much everybody on our team, I think, is blogged by this point. Like, we're pretty active there. Everybody from developers to developers in test to program managers. And then finally, the SharePoint team as a whole has a blog at blogs.msdn.com/SharePoint. Those are great resources to get started. I thought I had it in here, but apparently I don't. There's also a link to a list of all the sites that are actually running MOS 2007 internet-facing sites. I can get that for you guys. So at this point, I know we're a little bit early, but I'd like to kind of open it up for questions. And if we're lucky, you may get some answers. No guarantees, but we do what we can. So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask, what are kind of the Achilles heels of using the SharePoint environment for a public-facing website? One that comes to mind is about a $40,000 licensing fee. But what are the restrictions on the browsers that the end users can use? And as a corollary to that, what's kind of the near-term future path of going to cross-browser capabilities that we saw earlier today, being involved in SharePoint?
Those are fantastic questions. I'll start with I can tell you exactly what the sort of limitations are from both the authoring side and then the viewing side. And so that's the most interesting. Well, there's also the administrative side. So let's divide it into 3 sections. There's the viewing experience. So that's what someone who has no rights to your SharePoint environment sees in the internet-facing case. That's the anonymous user. And for that, you're really, in terms of cross-platform, you're really limited to whatever markup your master page and your page layout and whatever controls you use, whatever markup that they admit. There's no real limitations there. In terms of the authoring experience, one of the biggest caveats that I will point out is that the HTML editor, that's the in-place HTML editor, is only rich in IE. In Firefox, there is still an experience there, but it's direct HTML source editing mode. So that's one caveat to be aware of on the authoring side. For the most part, we are fully compatible with Firefox and Safari both for the authoring experience. The notable example is that HTML editor. Another notable example is some of the web part gallery interactivity, dragging and dropping and things like that. Some of that degrades to a less rich experience in alternate browsers such as Safari and Firefox. In terms of the administrative side of things, like managing the SharePoint site, all of that, the same caveats that apply to authoring also apply to the administrative side. For the most part, you can do, I personally use SharePoint to administer my personal site, which is running on Moss. And so I use Firefox completely for all of the administrative tasks. The only thing I use IE for is for the HTML editing. So, and then I think the second part to your question was about licensing. Well, you mentioned licensing. There's one thing, no matter how smart you think you are, you can never understand Microsoft licensing. So yeah, amen, right? So I am not the appropriate person to talk to about it. I would confuse you more, I'm sure. If you give me your card, I'm happy to get you connected with the right people if you have questions there. The future, yes. So we are still very early, sort of in the planning phase in terms of to the next release of SharePoint. And I personally, one of the reasons that I was excited to get to come to MIX was to get to really start conversations with you guys about either pain points that you have, both with previous versions of SharePoint or with the 2007 release, and specific things that you'd like to see. I'm interested both in really pinpointed stuff, like we have this particular need and we think it's probably unique, but maybe it's not, so we'll mention it. So we're interested in that, but we're also interested in sort of broad, wow, SharePoint just doesn't seem to get this, and what is that? And so if you can please start conversations with me, I would love to understand some of the pain points there, because we are very early in our planning process. I can tell you that cross-platform was a goal last release. We did a lot of work to enable the Firefox and the Safari experience that we enabled. We are continuing to focus on that in upcoming releases. That remains a primary focus for us, so we are committed to that. In terms of how far we'll get or how much support there will be, I can't make any claims at this point. Other questions? Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One, is there any best practice document on SharePoint 2007 for the complete life cycle of a project, especially an internet site?
You mean complete life cycle, including like custom development?
Yeah,
and
case studies kind of from requirements gathering to sizing, deployment.
Yes, there is actually, if you go to, I don't know the exact URL, but if you go to Microsoft.com and search for case studies, there's a filter by product, and you can specify Office SharePoint Server 2007, and that will filter all of the case studies. There are a number of case studies, including some of the sites that I showed today.
But pretty much most of them are business case studies. They don't go into technology. What I'm more looking at is kind of white papers on how things have been implemented and what's the caveats. There's a lot of those for SharePoint 2003. I'm not seeing anything for 2007.
Yeah, so I can tell you that I don't know exactly if there's anything in process for the specific question that you're asking. But what I can tell you is that with the relative recency of the 2007 release, documentation-wise, we are definitely still catching up to the level of documentation that's available for, say, the 2003 product. So at this point, not all of our documentation is ready. Not all of it's available. It is a work in progress, and there is more rolling out as we speak. So,
okay.
Yeah.
My second question is on scalability. SharePoint as such scales on an internet, but I think when it comes to the internet scenario, you're limited by the SQL Server backend. And SQL Server can just have 2 servers. You can just do a cluster of them. But when we have a website running, say, a couple of tens of web servers, all hitting one SQL Server, it's going to be a problem. So, is there a new solution in 2007? No.
So let me approach your question this way and see if I can answer it. In the past, when you were thinking about, sort of just at a high level thinking about a SharePoint topology, oftentimes you thought that you were limited by the size of your SQL server. And so the general rule of thumb was if you had X dollars to spend on server infrastructure to build your solution, spend a large portion of it in the SQL server, and then get a whole bunch of relatively inexpensive web front ends. Well, now that's sort of changing slightly, mostly because of the caching work that we've done. Because we've offloaded a lot of the hardcore database processing, and we've offloaded that into web front end processing. The processing doesn't actually occur on the web front end, but because of the caching work that we've done, a lot of that stuff gets serviced directly by the web front end. And so now that sort of guidance is changing somewhat into spend money on your SQL server, but then also get beefier web front ends, and you may not need as strong a SQL server. So I don't think that's the exact answer to your question, which is more aimed around, correct me if I'm wrong, I think your question is more about, well, how do we scale with SQL Server and SharePoint? Yes. And that question I would like to have a conversation with you about afterwards, because we can get pretty deep, but I don't have any sort of high-level answer for you.
Sure.
But please do
I'll be
come up
interested,
after.
because that's something whenever we go and talk to customers about MOS, especially customers in MCMS, we want to move them. They are saying we are again going to get the same bottleneck with SQL Server. So that's something I'll be very interested to talk to.
Okay, yeah. Are there other questions? Things people? Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I can speak to that directly from the ECM product team perspective, not for SharePoint as a whole, but for the specific smaller team that I work on. We are very, very keen on trying to develop a richer user community around the things that you're talking about, around custom templates, custom master pages, custom controls that people have built. To some extent, that is starting to occur. I think, what is it, Codeplex, I believe, is the site. So some of our developers have published a couple of side projects that they've worked on as Codeplex projects that are available for download. We're continuing to try and seed that. I'm looking at this custom Silverlight control that we built for the demo. We're looking at perhaps releasing that as a Codeplex project, as a starting project for things. So yes, we're looking at it. I think our approach at this point is sort of try to seed it with some projects that we've worked on internally that we're going to release as just sort of interesting things to look at and try to garner community support that way. It's a work in progress, something we're looking at, but obviously not quite as rich as we'd like yet. Sure.
What's the best resource if we have input, for example, we find like a SharePoint designer who will do the bug or some kind of esoteric configuration issue, things that just aren't addressed today in documentation?
So it depends. I would say that the news groups, there are product news groups that are available for all the products, and those are in general monitored, if not by the product team itself, by our support people on a regular basis. And so if you think you found a bug, or if you think you've hit something that's really blocking you from making progress, that's a great place to start. In terms of support, if you hit something major, I can't answer that question because it's sort of on a per customer basis. I don't know sort of what support agreements you may have in place. Being that SharePoint is a server product, the way that it's licensed and everything with CALs and yada yada yada. There's no just one-stop shop answer for real, like, large-scale support questions. But if you think you found a bug, the forums and the news groups are a good place to start. Not off the top of my head, but if you, sorry, what? Not off the top of my head, but if you leave me your card, I'm happy to follow up with you later and get you some more info. Yeah.
I have a question about the tools used by the designers of the websites. My company's adopted MOS 2007, and we've run into some issues where some people are using Visual Studio for master pages. People are exposed to the SharePoint Designer because that's kind of a recommended tool. And then we're also starting to use Expression Web, and those don't seem to work very well together when working against a MOS-based website. So can you speak to what your recommendations are there?
Sure. So in general, the basic recommendation is that SharePoint Designer is the premier tool to develop content and to work directly against a SharePoint website. That said, it is not by any means the only tool. You can certainly continue to use Notepad, and you can certainly continue to use Dreamweaver to develop HTML content, because in reality, for web content management pages and things, it's really just markup. It's just text. The challenge comes in that SharePoint Designer knows how to talk to SharePoint. It knows how to do things like check in and check out content. It knows how to do stuff like publish content. It knows how to open sites directly from SharePoint, from a SharePoint website. So there's a lot of sort of added value on top of using SharePoint Designer. That said, there's a definite clash, I guess is one way to put it, between people that want to use the Visual Studio integration, either because they're developers and they love Visual Studio, or because they have to because they're working on other ASP.NET projects and just happen to be working on SharePoint at this point. Unfortunately, we don't have a really solid integration story there yet. It is something that is definitely on our radar. You're by no means the first person to bring it up. And all I can say at this point is we're looking at it. In general, we always say SharePoint Designer. If there's something specific that you're trying to do, and you just don't even see how even with a more complicated workflow through SharePoint Designer and Visual Studio, how you could even get it working in a sort of seamless way, please do come talk to me. I want to understand what's going on there. Other questions? Yeah. I have another question. Sure.
Shout it from back here.
Sure.
If we're, say we're a commerce server shop, how do you envision SharePoint commerce server?
That is a fantastic question for the commerce server team. Unfortunately, I mean, I can tell you, is that what, did you have a bet on what I'd say? Because no, the question was about commerce server integration, and unfortunately, I really don't have an answer there. Please do give me your card though, so that I can get you connected with the right people from commerce server. I know it's something that we don't sort of have a cohesive story for now. It is something I believe that we're at least investigating. So be happy to let you know more info on that. Other questions? Yeah.
We've done an implementation in Holland in 2007, and we've had some styling difficulties actually.
Turn it off. Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah.
Turn it off. Okay. Can you just step up to the mic, because I have a strong feeling I'm probably not going to remember this well enough to repeat it. So.
Hi. I have a question about the styling of SharePoint 2007, because we did an implementation in Holland and we actually ran into some issues with the styling. I can see in the examples that there's lots more possibilities with SharePoint 2007 than before, but still, do you think that the designers should have some knowledge of SharePoint 2007 before making the design? Or should they be totally free?
That's a great question. In general, I would say that there is value as a designer. If you know, I don't know if there are still any designers in the crowd, but if you know that you're going to be working primarily against SharePoint, I think that there is value to understanding SharePoint as a technology. That said, There are examples that I am aware of where people have gone to a third-party design firm, for example, and have gotten mocks and have gotten the HTML templates that they've used to then go and build the SharePoint site. And it certainly works. There are some, yeah, I see the sort of smirk, yes. There are some things that you need to be aware of there, because from a, when you get, so typically, and I think this is true, when you get markup back from a design firm, for example, it's pretty clean HTML, and then the basic workflow that you go through is drop that into an appropriate master page and page layout in SharePoint Designer, and then insert the dynamic pieces of SharePoint content into the appropriate places. The problem and the sort of smithing that has to happen at that point is getting things looking exactly right, because at the time that the designer made it, he or she was unaware of the additional markup that you're going to actually be putting in with SharePoint. So it's not sort of, you just throw in the markup, you throw in the controls, and then you're done. There is going to be some sort of work involved there in terms of getting it all playing well together. However, it is still a great starting point, because that's basically what I did when I moved my site to Moss. I took my old site, view source, copy-pasted, and then just took out everything that wasn't appropriate and threw in the appropriate controls. So that methodology is sort of tried and proven. So. Other questions? Yeah, if you could use the mic, please.
Are there any best practices documented for migrating MSCMS 2002 sites to Moss?
I am so glad you asked, because I happen to have been the program manager that was in charge of MCMS 2002 migration, and I designed and built the feature, so I'm sort of like, yes, I'm the guy to talk to about that. Yes, there are 4 white papers available on migrating MCMS 2002 applications to Moss 2007. There's an in-product feature around migrating that content. There are 4 white papers about it. One's, I can give you more specifics if you're interested on the specifics of the white papers. In addition, there are partners, most notably Metalogics, that has a migration manager. It doesn't use the stuff that Microsoft provides out of the box, but it's slightly more customizable and can be a better fit depending on your migration needs. So if you're scoping out different migration options, it probably warrants giving them a call and checking out what they have to provide and their pricing and things like that, just to view different options. But I have it on good authority that the Metalogics migration manager is quite good and quite effective for CMS 2002 to Moss migrations. Other questions? Okay. So we're done a little bit early, and I do have this demo available. I know it's kind of late. It's totally optional if you guys are interested in taking a look. Please stick around. It's going to be a kind of small screen, cramped. I'm probably just going to bring it down to the floor there and sit down, and you guys are welcome to check it out, ask questions. In addition, I'm going to be milling about. I'm an attendee for the rest of the week here. Feel free to grab me, pull me aside at any time. I'll also be at the MIX chat, so feel free to swing by and ask me questions. In addition, my email address is tyler.butler@microsoft.com. I can't promise that I'll respond quickly, but I do my very best to respond to mails that I get from you. So feel free to drop me a quick line, and I'll try my best to get back to you. So thanks a lot, everybody.